Hi, this is Jared from the G2 Gallery podcast, and today I'm interviewing one of our photographers, Stuart Sperling. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So we have an exhibit coming up that's in 3D, which is the first for us. And 3D photography it seems to me like this, like 3D, when I think of 3D, I think of like 50s 3D monster movies, and then it went away, like 3D went away for a long time. And then it kind of came back in cinema.
Yeah.
But in photography, I don't know the history of that. Do you know sort of like when was there like a period where it was in vogue and then it went away, or was
one of the coolest aspects for me is that some of my heroes, like Carlton Watkins, they back in the beginning of photography, 3D stereoscopic photography was just as much part of photography right then. It goes back to the originating days of photography.
Wow.
Yeah, in the 19th century.
Wow. And so people were photographing in 3D then. And then did you see it go away at all, or has it always sort of been developing? I mean, when...
Well, it certainly had been very active in the form of sort of travelogue type of photographs, so people who could be sitting in their parlors or just being wherever it is that someone might be enjoying photography, they would use a stereo viewer to sort of go around the world and experience places in the world that they hadn't experienced yet, or that they might never experience.
Right.
So, that's always been happening in terms of 3D. It has that novelty factor in that regard, and it has the aspect of... Yeah, I think I don't have any following statement right there.
Oh, sure, yeah. So when you first saw these 3D photographs, what was your initial reaction?
When I had grown up, I'd been seeing 3D in the form of IMAX films, was I think the first of it. I guess I'd seen some of the 1950s things.
Yeah.
Those movies at the time to me had just occurred as... I wasn't really too interested in the content. I've been really interested in a lot of the content that one sees in nature and adventure films. And so to see the world, especially sort of undersea things and mountainscapes, and to see those in large format in an IMAX movie, and certainly then to see them in 3D, had me really engaged with the content in a way that had me feeling in touch with my own sense of discovery.
Yeah.
I felt really interested in being in the landscape, just as a kid sitting in an audience. I felt like I was there.
Yeah.
And so I think that was sort of one of the things. Growing up on the East Coast, I hadn't really encountered landscapes like that before, but I felt like there was a seed born in that particular viewing experience. And so I was enthralled with the experiential cinema, and I was enthralled by landscape.
Yeah.
So then once I came out to the West Coast for film school and really opened up into experimental film and experiential film, and I really encountered the Western landscape. And so combining those two, it was pretty much, as soon as I got here, I started shooting pictures like what you'll see in the gallery.
Yeah.
In high school, I had experimented with shooting 3D just to try to figure out the process. And it was cool to figure out the process, but I didn't really have content at that point. I was inspired by exploratory photography and was really interested in the space program. But I hadn't been photographing anything other than just kind of getting some technical mastery together in that regard. And I had always been interested in art and in expression, and that poetic sensibility that one encounters when one is present to the wonders of the landscape and the way light plays across the land. And so I'd enjoyed that through observing artwork and just observing the world as a human. And then once I came out to the West, I discovered my own interactions with the creativity and the landscape itself.
You know what's funny is, being from the East Coast as well, when you talk about like experiential photography and film, it always makes me think of Disney, because there's this weird thing growing up on the East Coast that you see these films from Disney and like these experiences of the West Coast, and it seems so exotic, and it seems like something like Disney kind of like brought to your television or brought to the theater or whatever of seeing it. And it is of like the West Coast, and it is of these like the canyons and stuff that growing up on the East Coast you just don't experience, because it's weird. Do you find that the East Coast doesn't like lend itself to 3D photography as much as the West Coast? I don't know if you feel that same way.
I actually do feel that. I mean, to me, one of the aspects that's enjoyable about 3D is the sense that it invites the viewer to extend his or her own perception outward beyond one's normally felt physical boundary of one's own body. You know, like in normal life, when I look out on the world, it usually feels like it's from the perspective of my own self, my own personal history. And certainly in the East Coast, I feel very much like an individual moving about within the architecture of a landscape or within a social landscape and such. When in the natural forms of the West, and also in the East, if one's in the mountains, but I grew up in a city sort of area, and then also in the ocean. That's the first place I really encountered this aspect, which is the sense of being transported into a sense of self where the boundary exists all the way out to the horizon, the boundary of self, in a sense, or out to the sky. And so growing up in the East, the sky often was clouded, and the visual sense often had objects blocking one's view that goes out to the horizon. I had always found that when I was in the areas of the ocean, you know, beaches and out on the sea, etc., then I had felt that sort of sense of expanded sense in a way. And coming out west, there is necessarily that sort of grandeur, and I think that was one of the things that photography happened to be at the same time that there was this American expansion out to the west, and so people had been seeing in a new way, both through photography itself and through encountering a viewpoint on the land that is larger than one's sort of accustomed viewpoint if one hasn't grown up in that sort of space.
That's absolutely how I feel as well. You know, spending so much time in the East Coast, you do feel like you are a part of something that's already been sort of established or laid out, and whereas the West Coast, it doesn't feel that way. So then you started photographing as a kid, right? Then, I mean, in high school, you were kind of experimenting.
Yeah, I was experimenting with photography. I've always been interested in all art, and so I was doing a lot more painting and drawing, and then I learned photography, and then throughout undergraduate school, I was doing all sorts of art, photography fairly minimally, sculpture, painting, and filmmaking, and then after some job stuff after college, then I came out to go to graduate school in film.
What school?
USC.
So, do you mind if I ask what year was that? Like, around what time was that?
That was in '93.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then, who was sort of like the dominant USC? Like, would it have been Lucas, or who was like the?
Yeah, at the time, Lucas was the biggest, and certainly still is the biggest name as far as a USC person. And when I had been in high school, actually, I'd been very interested in special effects. Oh. And I would say mainly because of imagination. And so I used to really be interested in contextual sort of artwork and things that would create a landscape in one's own, I guess. When I was growing up, I was very interested in contextual artwork, and so filmmakers and artists who would create a place for my imagination to explore was really exciting to me. And so I was interested in special effects for that reason back then, and I had been reading through books that were done at the time of Industrial Light and Magic's sort of creativity, and books showing the work that they had done, and I'd been interested in that sort of field. And then I'd dropped from that interest because I didn't really just want to be a technical person. And then I came out and went to film school on my own once I had really developed a sense of being interested in character and story and emotion and such like that, you know. And so with photography, once I came out here and studied film, I found that photography was a way to really be expressive and engaging with all of the things that excited me, particularly being out in nature, and to both connect for my own personal fulfillment in the act of creativity, and then also to be able to, I guess, speak whatever it is that I find interesting in my own viewpoint in the world, and do it without the constraints of putting together a large-scale process-oriented business function the way a large film would be, you know, 70, 80 people.
Yeah. It's a massive undertaking. Yeah. That's really, I mean, so then you were in film school and you sort of like had sort of, it seems like made sort of realizations about more specifically where you were engaged. Mm-hmm. And then, is that when you picked up the camera, or were you photographing that entire time as well? I mean, I guess you were.
Yeah, I'd been photographing that whole time. I mean, that was certainly an aspect of learning cinematography, was shooting a lot of still pictures. Yeah. And I had already been shooting still pictures and enjoying, you know, it's just an instantly creative thing, as we now see with people with cell phones, and access to camera picture making is easy for, I mean, it's not easy to make pictures necessarily, but it's easy to access that act of creativity for everybody, and I think it's fantastic. You know, we've got so many pictures being made at any given second in the world, and I think one of the reasons why it's become so popular now isn't only the access, but it's also the fact that the act of making a picture is an act of encountering one's own creative act in the moment, and that we all find a sense of enjoyment of being able to create something, and just even creating a composition of a friend at a party or something creates a sense of satisfaction and joy when looking at, oh, I made this, you know, or oh, here's, let me show you this. Right. And so back to the question that you've just been asking, I'm just going to restart. Sure. So I'd been working with cameras and such, and then when moving out to the West, I had been here ostensibly for film school, and that's where I was learning the most in terms of technical things and in terms of expression and how to use the grammar of visual communication. Sure. I would say, though, the more potent thing that I was encountering was by living out here in Los Angeles. It's a place where you can be at the top of the world on a very tall mountain with a vast viewpoint at one moment, and then another moment you can be in the waves. Yeah. And so I was really opening up into the, I would say, the flowing sensibility that one encounters when one moves to California. So there's a California flavor, not just of the natural landscape itself, but also the history of California, wherein people have broadened their own horizons through inquiry into what is the self, through encounters with various types of philosophy, Eastern philosophy, Native American story. Yeah. So when I was growing up in the East Coast, there was sort of a traditional way of approaching the world. I had always felt like I had an interesting observer state sort of mind in looking out on the world. And then when I came out to California, I discovered that there was an active cultivation of a sense of inquiry and a sense of exploration. And so looking into, I'd say looking into consciousness and looking into what it is to be human, I would say spending a lot of time alone in a landscape is an opportunity for a person to, I would say, to let go of any conventional sense of understanding of who one is, or at least I'll speak for myself. So alone in a forest or alone in the desert, I just found tremendous fascination in the deserts. I've always been interested in the sky. Mm-hmm. And so I love the work of artists who work with the sky. Richard Mizrak being an amazing photographer in that regard. And So I'd seen work that relates to the desert and to the sky, and then when being in nature, and particularly being alone in nature, there is, I guess, what one might just call like a childlike sensibility, a child mind.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what is that over the next bend? Let me go and explore it. I'll go hike and look at it.
Yeah.
Or let me just sit and watch for a couple of hours as the light changes. And it's not the same thing as watching a character move through a story, but it's a different way of, it's a different sort of entertainment. I guess you'd call it ambient entertainment. I've really been interested in ambient and minimalist, minimalist art.
Well, I definitely see in your work a very, well, let me start by saying that, photography, to me, working in the Scholar for 2 years, has really helped me get an understanding, too, of this American spirit. That photography, to me, seems to be very American, and in multiple ways. I see a lot of photographs that capture New York City, the streets of New York City, or the South, or Chicago, or Louisiana, just as well as the vast space of the West. But it's all very American, and I definitely see a good sense of like self-exploration and like exploring the new frontier in your work. And it's very classic American, but at the same time, it's very sort of on the edge because it's, understanding yourself as well, which is always cutting edge. No matter what time you're in, it's always a cutting edge thing.
Yeah.
So I like that you said that you felt that you had a different understanding in a different context of yourself when you were out in nature. Do you think that had to do with the age you were, how old you were, and sort of what you had gone through, like leaving home, living on the East Coast, going to school, and sort of being more specific about who you were, or discovering
That's
things?
a great question. Yeah, I'd say yes. It was really being in the West, or at least discovering nature out West, was a chance for me to experience myself outside of the social way of being that had been growing up and having a brother and a sister and having classmates and just having people who I engage in daily life or going to work. It's a social existence. Mm-hmm. I mean, we all live a social existence. Yeah. I hadn't really been in a landscape or in any place where there is nobody but myself for 50 miles in all directions, and so when I encountered that sort of experience, it was a different way of seeing, and it does correspond to being at that time in my 20s when I first was encountering the land in that way. In a sense, I guess you could say a rite of passage, or at least just dropping into a new world or a new way of seeing. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's independent of age, and anyone can really just let go of one way of being and enter into another way of being for any period of time. We do that every night when we go to sleep. And it has that sort of dreamlike state of just like a massive shift when you're all of a sudden. I mean, I was also really doing a lot of. I was hiking with the Sierra Club, and I was reading John Muir and encountering writers of the American West and people who had experienced the flowing state of nature. And I think that's one of the things that I've found really interesting, particularly in this series, which is about about solidity dissolving away amidst fluidity, and the two interacting with each other. So wherein we see land commonly as a very solid and grounding force that is very knowable, understandable. In the Southwest, land becomes more liquid and fluid, and certainly when it's wrought upon by the flow of water and wind, the sense of separateness between what is atmosphere and what is ground kind of dissolves away and the two mingle with each other. So you've got the ground becomes a swirl. And that's obviously fascinating from a visual standpoint, but I think it also really is enticing at, in a sense, the spirit level or the philosophical viewpoint, just being able to see solidity and fluidity dissolve into each other. It's instantaneously apparent in the Southwest. You see geology moving right in front of you, and so that expands, for me, my own sense of my own place in time. And so when I'm there in the southwestern landscape, I exist as a normal self functioning on a normal day-to-day time scale, but I'm also directly encountering geological time. And because of the way erosion works out in the dry landscapes of the Southwest, geological time actually happens, or at least it is seen as happening right in front of you. It's a much more minimal sort of viewpoint. It's not all covered over with lush vegetation, which itself is super interesting. But in this particular series, it's just as much about water as it is about rock.
You know what's interesting is talking about solidity and fluidity of work is that your other work is quite the opposite. It's these brandscapes. Mm-hmm. And that to me feels like the exact opposite of what you've been describing.
That one's definitely a cultural, it's a series that's about culture and about...
Do you actually mind describing that for a second before?
Sure.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, so I've got another series that's called Brandscapes. I'm not sure if we're going to be showing it in this show. And what Brandscapes is, it's a series of macro photographs shot in stereo 3D. These ones are in full super saturated color. And in these macro shots, what you see is small, tiny little landscapes shot in the American West, in the same sorts of places where one has always had conversations photographically about the American West throughout the history of photography. So California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, mostly the South. And let's see, I'll just pause there for a second. And in these pictures, we see the monumental shaping of the land of rock and sometimes of vegetation and water. But a dominant object that's happening inside each frame is there's a piece of cultural debris, in a sense, a wrapper usually, or something that had been left in the landscape by someone who'd passed through that particular space and dropped something, a candy wrapper, a food wrapper.
I saw like a Barney, like a child's had Barney on it.
The lip balm.
Lip balm, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Soda bottles, that sort of thing. And so in these pictures, what one sees in each frame is in a sense, a dialogue between this particular sculptural object, and they occur as very sculptural when seen in 3D, and then when isolated in a very, that the frame really just isolates the shape and the form. And so you see the shape, and then you also see the way the land is influenced by that shape. So that you've got this shape that's been living in that place for sometimes a couple of years since whoever dropped it there, and then I encounter it just archaeologically by happening upon it.
Yeah.
And then I can see how the water and wind has maybe eroded the land around this object, but the object stays there. And so you see sort of a small little micro canyon forming around a piece of plastic that's been sitting there. And then also you can see the way that the sun has degraded the color of that object, or is reflecting off of a shiny reflective bit on the plastic or the paper.
Yeah.
And so both that object and the land are influencing each other. And I find that interesting because there's a major aspect of photography in the American Western landscape is the interaction between culture, human impact, and landscape, and the way the two influence each other. and so that's been a major part of the photographic conversation since the dawn of photography. And here, just happening upon these little archaeological pieces, I've seen the same sort of conversation functions down at that little tiny level. And so that just fascinates me, that there's...
Yeah, that is true. It is sort of like this. It is sort of similar to like a housing development or like a big office park. Going into like this forest or whatever. You know what I mean? It sort of does feel like a parking lot in the middle of this beautiful area. It is really interesting because I definitely see what you're saying, and it poses a question for me is, do you feel, I know that you said you as a person can sort of become fluid in your environment, in nature, but do you think people as a mass can do that? Do you think that people in the mass, as a mass, can dissolve into the environment, or do you think that those photographs sort of say that these are two separate things that are just together? Do you know what I'm saying?
That's a good question. I definitely think that that photography and just the natural landscape itself, and particularly the institution of the national parks and state parks and local parks, the fact that we've created places and made institutions whose function is to encourage the population to engage with the landscape, as well as, of course, to protect the landscape and the habitats and the animals and plants that live there. The fact of those institutions and the value that we've placed on them, I think really comes from the sense of wonderment and the sense of groundedness and relaxation of the spirit, as well as activation of the spirit that I would say is an aspect of humanness. So any person, when brought into connection with nature, has an opportunity to experience oneself in a new way, and that new way might be particular to each individual. At the same time, I think the landscapes that might not be necessarily seen as intimate landscapes, the ones that are seen in this series here, which are southwestern large-scale landscapes, invite viewers to really see the vastness of what is, or what life is. And so looking out and seeing horizons at every angle with no constraint of a building right next to you. It's a reason why people drive or fly from around the world to go to the Grand Canyon or to go to the mountains. I'm trying to remember the Muir quote about going to the mountains and experiencing a sense of a different pace. Yeah. It's a fantastic quote. I don't have it on hand right now in my mind. And then, of course, going and being in intimate settings within nature, let's say a gully filled with ferns and dripping water, or just looking at two animals close up. That's a different sort of experience that one encounters in nature.
To me, the two works really sort of still really complement each other very well, but they both feel like they're combined in an experimental and daring look that you are attempting. And I want to go back a little bit into what you were saying about when you were going to USC in the early 90s, that you started getting into experimental film. And that's daring because it's I mean, in film school, it's like not as daring because it's like you kind of like want to push your boundaries and stuff, but continuing it on your own is super daring because that's seems to me like more deliberate as opposed to just discovery, Sure. So that takes a bit of confidence. And do you feel like you continue to do that because you know yourself really well, or because you don't know yourself really well?
Ooh, that's a cool question. Both.
Yeah,
you know?
Sure. Yeah. That's the right answer if there was one.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I'm really excited about being myself more and more as I do get older, and so in a sense, there's no reason not to be myself or not to continue to know myself more. And then as doing that, there's whole realms of encountering, you know, what isn't known. I mean, in a sense, the experience of grandeur or awe in a mountain setting or in an ocean setting, anything that has like a horizon in it, really.
Yeah.
And certainly a mountain setting has the horizon out even further away, or just large-scale forces that are archetypal and take time to occur, you know, such as a mountain that develops over years and years and years, or actions that happen to just be massive and take place right away, such as, you know, a big rock fall, or waterfalls that are happening right away.
So the other thing I wanted to ask you about is sound, because sound plays a big role in the way that you use your work.
I love sound.
Yeah. So what's your history with sound and your like relationship?
I've always loved music, and when I was in college I was involved in radio a lot, and then worked in radio, and then I have always worked with sound in terms of at a technical level, conducting recording sessions and such. And then it became an avenue of I'd say an avenue of engaging the land and engaging culture as well. I love documentary sound recording and ambient sound recording, and I like to listen to the world in general, and then that turned into enjoying making recordings of the world, and then listening to them for my own pleasure, and then presenting them as, I guess, you know, as documentary recordings for people to feel transported into a sensibility that might be whatever's present in the recording that I've made, you know. So one can then feel like one's engaged with the culture of a place that I've recorded, or engaged with the natural landscape of a place that I've recorded.
And so, and that draws into, you said you still work with sound in your day job as well. So what do you do in your day job?
I'm a documentary sound recordist mostly, also for media productions, and then also for narrative media, you know, so story-oriented programs. And
that's a hard thing, recording sound for documentaries, because you're just not aware. There's no kind of pre-planning in that. In documentaries, right? Because are you out in the field working with that? So how does that work? Do you sort of have to be like in a meditative sort of like state and sort of understand what's around? Like how does that work?
Well, it's actually, I would say, yeah, you know, that's actually a good way of saying it. It's really being aware I'd say hyper aware in a what they call like a run and gun situation where the camera crew is floating around in a place, moving from A to B. The sound person is usually connected via wires to the camera, or is listening for what the producer is wanting to do next, or listening to what the characters are up to and the world is up to. And then there's the physical obstructions of a place. And so it's kind of like a performative act of moving about, you know, like having to step over this, that, or the other, but not be inside the view of the camera, but also making sure that the sound is being recorded effectively, from the placement of the microphone to the technical stuff. So it's a dance, I would say, yeah. And so that aspect has, when I'm engaged in that, it's kind of like a very immediate level of awareness, and in that sense, it's meditative.
Do you? Okay, sorry.
And then for the artwork, the sound work that's more artistic, that I really enjoy, is explicitly oriented towards meditation, or towards observation and awareness. And so I'm really interested in engaging a place and engaging the emotional scape of the place. So it could be a nature setting, which could either be invigorating or be relaxing, or it's either a personal or a cultural space, and so I'll really be attempting to elicit in the listener a sense of place. So with the sound work, what I endeavor to do is create what you might see as like a virtual reality soundscape, and I'll use a technique known as binaural sound recording, which could be akin to stereoscopic 3D photography, in that it's a type of sound recording that creates a spatial realism for the listener that is more sensual and textural and, in a sense, spatially accurate than a standard stereo recording with normal standard stereo mic techniques. And so in a binaural recording, what one is listening to is a recording where both channels are, in a binaural recording, the listener is presented with sound that was originally recorded from the perspective of a human head, where the microphones are placed at the space where the human ears normally are, in a structural head that mimics the actual densities and shaping of an actual human head. And so oftentimes one will see a recordist with a sculptural head on a tripod and microphones right at where the ear holes are.
Yeah.
And what that does is it captures the sound field in a very realistic way, taking into account the various aspects of the physical oral environment. What I like to do is I'll take tiny microphones and I'll place them into my ears, holding them in with earplugs, and then I'll navigate a space or sit in a space, and I'll record using my own head as the participatory aspect of the place, and in a sense my head becomes the microphone. I will caution just right now to say, don't put things in your ears. It's not necessarily a safe thing to do, so I don't advocate that unless, I've done a lot of research about human hearing and about the structure of the ear and stuff.
When you're just out in the field and you're recording sound, and then when you have what you're using for your artistic work, is there like a natural rhythm, or do you have, is it when you replay both the stuff that you just kind of raw and then what you've been working with, do you see like a natural rhythm in both, or is it alter, or how do those two differ?
That's a great question. Right now I'm really exploring how the two interact with each other. I've certainly explored sound interacting with visuals in relation to film, and then in terms of the interaction of still photography with installed sound art. That's a really exciting exploration, and I don't think I have any answers as to where that's going, and so that's actually exciting because it's just super playful. I know that one of the things I really enjoy about sound art is the fact that the visuals occur within one's imagination as a listener. And so in terms of its interaction with still photography, I see it maybe lending itself more towards minimalist photography. But then again, it can really work super well with story-oriented, programmatic narrative photography and journalism, and you can hear the lushness of an environment or of a story with sound, and then also be witness to the visual storytelling as well and the character, and so those are fantastic. At the same time, the sound art that I've really enjoyed so far has been fairly minimalist oriented, so I would call it ambient sound. Sometimes it does certainly include people and cultural settings. I've done documentary sound recordings of the ambience out a lot in New York City, where I'm from New York, and I like to do things that are psychologically activating and that are culturally significant. So I've done work relating to the attacks of 9/11, and I've done work relating to social settings just around the country. And I would say mostly what the sound work has been natural sound. And so I really enjoy sitting in a place and recording the sound of an environment such that a listener can have access to the emotional feeling of a wide open space or of a small intimate space.
Yeah.
It really can create in the listener an emotional experience, or it really can create in the listener an emotional experience. And a sense of connection. And for me, when I'm making the recordings, it's just as much of a meditation as it is when I'm out photographing.
Right.
And so what I'll do in this instance is I would sit in a place and I would be motionless for like 45 minutes. And so I would be meditating while doing the recording.
Yeah.
And the reason to be motionless is generally so that the microphone perspective doesn't move about for the listener, unless I want it to.
Yeah. So, but like, do you ever watch somebody who listens to these recordings? I mean, have you ever watched them?
Oh yeah.
I mean, what happens? It differs for every person, I'm sure. But like, what have you seen happen in some of the?
I've usually seen a sense of peace come upon the person's face.
Yeah.
Or a sense of interest. Because it's, I guess one is really letting go of the immediate moment that's in front of yourself, as far as your day-to-day way of being, and then you're all of a sudden transported into a different environment.
Yeah.
And if you set aside some time to do that and you're listening, whether it's taking a break from work or in a museum setting, then I've at least speaking with people afterwards and just kind of seeing them listening, I've definitely seen them really in the space.
Yeah.
And then for me, that's actually exciting when I'm doing the recording itself.
Yeah.
So I'm very much in the space when I'm doing that recording. I'm very rarely thinking about anything other than certainly the technical aspects of making the sound happen or the body positioning that I'm in. So I might be in a place that's super cold, or sitting in a stream and having the recorder be kind of up at my neck so it's not getting wet. And then I'm focused on my physical sensations, and I'm focused on where the microphones are in relation to whatever's creating the sound.
Yeah.
And then the listener is very much engaged with the texture of the sound, because the nature of this type of recording process is very textural and spatial. It really, I guess you'd call it like a surround sound technique.
Yeah.
Then the listener is really just in that space, very much there, except that it doesn't have a storyline or visuals, so they're really playfully like a child just painting the picture for themselves, if that's what they're interested in doing.
Sure. You have these two shows. Where do you see yourself going with your photography?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I've begun to see myself more and more as an artist of context. I'm really interested in evoking in the viewer or listener for work that engages sound as well, in evoking a state of being, whether it might be one of relaxation or one of excitement or fascination. It varies based on the content of the work. But I'm finding that I'm really interested in creating spaces or creating contexts, in a sense, creating an ambiance, or one might call it ambient artwork, wherein a person is still invited to be oneself. It's not like I'm necessarily creating a programmatic narrative piece, which is telling the story of a particular character or a particular scene where XY happened, like a Renoir painting of a scene in a Parisian bar or whatnot. Let's maybe avoid the Renoir part, but
that's fine.
In the edit, But as someone who's sort of an artist of the ambient, I like to create environments. Or at least represent environments, or present a field for the imagination to be at play. And so as far as the future goes, I really do love bringing that sensibility to bear in regards to portrayals of architecture and of nature, and then also particularly in terms of states of mind or states of heart and being. And so while in one instance I might do something that creates a real sense of place in terms of the formal qualities of a space, I'm very interested as well in the emotional and expressive qualities of a place or of a personality. And so I'm really interested in inquiring into any forms of artwork that will encourage a person to be perceptually engaged with their own senses and to be participatory in their own environment as well as the environments of the work that's present for me.
Sure. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming in, and I usually end my podcast with a question to the artist about what advice they would give to somebody who's much younger. But I would like to.
I'll just quickly answer that one. Just be yourself.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like such a cliche, but it's like the hardest thing.
It is
to do.
Well, yeah, especially as one's encountering so much amazing work from all around.
Yeah.
Whether it be during schooling or just by living in a time where there is so much amazing creativity out there.
Yeah.
I would suggest anybody, really use anything that you see as a catapult for your own creativity and your own imagination. And then spend, a bunch of time just being yourself and being with whatever tools you're being with, and then finding a sense of excitement about whatever tools you're working with, and then give up one tool, take on another tool, or learn techniques, etc., and sort of lock yourself in and spend time playing with those techniques, and then honing in on whatever feels most you, during that.
That's a really good. That's a very good instruction on sort of how to be yourself.
I guess.
That's really great because there's so much to consume, especially now.
Oh yeah.
You know. So, but the question.
So yeah, you had it more fully. Yeah.
Well, I did, but this is sort of more interesting, I think, than maybe the question I was going to ask you. But my question was to people who, going along the lines of like experimenting, people who are not experimenting, people who are not, who are maybe afraid to reach outside. What would be like a good sort of realization to have that you can experiment and fail and have that be okay? Like, what would be your advice to somebody along that line?
As far as stepping outside of, say, one's own pattern, that sort of thing,
and like fear of failure when they do.
Yeah. I think one of the things that can be constraining is feeling like one is out to generate a piece of work. In a sense, being with one's tools is kind of more where it's at. Mm-hmm. So it's more the sense of being with one's own creative sense, being with the act of making a picture or making a sculpture, or the act of making, or the act of reinterpreting, the act of listening, the act of saying. I might suggest focusing on the act as opposed to the outcome.
Yeah.
Certainly, in a sense, as photojournalists aren't necessarily always focused on, I must create. I mean, they actually have assignments that are very specific. You have to deliver pictures. But at the same time, the way they go about the delivery of the pictures is by being in the experience. Mm-hmm. They can't help but being in the experience. And some of the greatest work that I've seen in terms of actual humanistic photography and or humanist photography and photojournalism is work that is an expression of a given moment. And then sometimes when one looks at that moment, one can see the larger forces at play in the world, and those might be the works that the editor chooses to display publicly. Yeah. And certainly that the photographer aims for when shooting the picture.
Yeah.
But at the same time, sort of as a model, one can see that the act of creating that picture is the act of being in the experience and being a human, alive with one's tools and one's sense of inspiration. Even if that inspiration is just merely to represent, which, I mean, I couldn't even say merely. I mean, that's a huge, huge thing. But by being in contact with the creative act live in the moment, that's more important, I'd say, than the goal of creating a piece, because then it's just one is doing it, and then after one's doing it, then one is editing. I would say one of the things that I've really learned a lot about myself, or one of the things, one of the arenas in which I've learned a lot about myself most recently really is in the arena of post-production and of sitting with my work after having shot it. And so I would really encourage people to live with the pieces that they're creating for some time in their general day-to-day being. You know, have it be running on your computer and not even editing at any point. You know, just that there it is, it's living on the screen, fading from one image to the next, or printing some things out and hanging them on the wall. Live in a space with your work, and then it'll begin to filter itself and you'll see it anew in different ways. And so you'll begin to see what types of cropping or what work stands out, what ways of presenting the work or what ways of looking at the work or what little parts of the work become most fascinating to you. And in that sense, you'll begin to see your personality come alive in the work, and it will become more your own. And you'll see which things work for you and which things don't.
Right. That's a really smart way of putting it, because I feel like that there is a lot of pressure now of like immediacy, and that like what you did it and then that's the final product, and that's not the case really ever. There's always work to be discovered and had, and not just like immediacy and just seeing the final product. The final product is bigger than just this one photo or this one thing, you know. So, but I want to thank you so much. This was a very enlightening podcast, and you can visit your website if you want to plug your website,
StuartSperling.com,
and
that's ST. Well, you'll see the name presented.
Yeah, exactly. And then your work will be in the gallery from
June 11 through July 31.
That sounds great. All right. Well, thank you so much. If you're interested in, I'm sure you will be interested in seeing this great Americana Western photography in black and white and also in 3D at the G2 Gallery. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. And this is Jared from the G2 Gallery. Please tune in. We'll have more podcasts coming to you. Thanks. All thoughts expressed in this interview are that of the interviewee and not of the G2 Gallery.